I don't like. I write little drums to. If I can avoid it, to write drums to catch the brass and saxes, because when you make a rim shot, you're cutting out the middle, cutting out the inside voices.
Yes.
You hear the impact of the band. Of the beat, but when you crash at a cymbal, when you accent it with drums, you lose the juiciness of the voice.
You lose the sound of the chord.
Yeah, sound of the chord. That Billy May stuff, the sort of Dixie, sort of May.
Yeah.
You listen to it, the drums are just keeping time.
Yeah, Billy May wasn't there today, was he?
No.
Is he okay?
Is that a little squinty for you?
I don't know. I think so. Let's see, Ralph. Ralph Grierson.
He sent his regards. I was surprised to see Les Brown. Is he now a regular member? He comes to all the lunches and.
The man I was trying to think of was Ralph Kessler.
Ralph Kessler, yes. I didn't see him today.
I sat next to him last time I was here.
I didn't see him. Yes, last time I was here, in fact, it was Les Brown who was the guest.
Well,
we're going.
Okay.
Hey, David?
Yes?
Oh, there you are. Okay. Are you all set?
Yeah, we're rolling. You're rolling, I'll lock it up.
Okay, have fun.
We're going to be locked in.
Okay, yeah. Are you going to interview me from off camera?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, I'll try to get on axis.
Yeah, so you can look through it from time to time.
And so you can look pretty much straight at the camera and happen to feel like looking at me.
Right at the lens, yeah.
Could you two move closer to the camera so she wants to look at either of you?
Oh.
I see, but not
Not
in
be looking
shot.
far away.
Yeah.
No, all the way in. Come all the way as close to the camera.
So she can talk to
Yeah,
us.
so,
Right.
so just,
Yes.
yeah, that's fine. Just right here. Both of you.
As you were.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Joe. Good job.
So let's see. Well, I thought it'd be fun if we could fill in whatever you forgot to say today.
Well, I didn't say very much about the Goon Show because.
Oh, that's a good idea. Let's talk about that.
Why don't we talk about the Goon Show? Well, I mean, I didn't want to get into too much detail with anything today because, there was a lot of stuff to cover. And if I got into the whole thing of all of those different things, it would have been very, very boring and gone on for too long. But, of course, there's a lot to say about the Goon Show, of course. I think the first Goon Show wasn't called the Goon Show. I think it was called Crazy People. And I think it was a show that was done about 1950. And it was produced by Pat, what was his name now? Pat Dixon, BBC producer, who was a very nice man, actually. He was a great jazz fan. And I think that was in effect the first Goon Show. And of course it had Michael Bentine, who was in the show for probably, I think when I started conducting the show in 1953, I think Michael Bentine was still in it. But after that year he wasn't. He wasn't in it. And then, of course, it was just the three, Spike and Harry and Peter. And we usually recorded these shows on a Sunday night in various places, but for a very long time we did it at a place called the Camden Theatre in Camden Town, a suburb of North London. And it was a great panic to do it because I was very busy doing other things during the week, recording in Phillips. And I never did touch the Goon Show until Sunday morning, you see. And I'd previously, during the course of the week, perhaps worked out the routine with Max and what he wanted to do. And then what I would do is I'd get up early on Sunday morning, I'd do Max's arrangement first, and the copies would arrive, start copying behind me. Then I usually had to write a little ending for a Ray Ellington number, and then I'd write some cues. And I'd look at the script and think, now what have I got to do here? And so I'd write the cues, and then we'd get a taxi to Camden Theatre, the copyists, and I would get a taxi, and then when we got there, copyists would give out the music that he'd already done, but then he'd go into a little room somewhere, still copying cues, you see. And then, of course, during the course of the rehearsal, Spike would think of other cues that he'd like to do, and some of them were just chords, and very often you wanted these chords to sound bad, to kind of sound thin or miserable sounding, and so then I used to dictate those things. And the great thing is that when I look at my royalty returns, I see things like chord in G, an amount of money, or chord in F, or chord in D, all kinds of stuff. And cymbal crashes, things like that. You get a little money for that. And those things never saw paper, they were just something that somebody scribbled on their part. And that's how it was done.
So you didn't ever see the rehearsals run-throughs, you just worked from the script?
Well, I worked from the script. Well, I don't think anybody saw anything. In fact, if you tell me that they met before Sunday, the boys, the three of them, I'd be surprised. I think we all turned up at about 4 or 5 o'clock on a Sunday, and they did a run-through. We did a run-through. And I think they were probably reading all for the first time. And went through the run-through, and then we had a long break when everybody went off then and drank too much. Certainly there were us. And then we came back and did the show. There would always be a warm-up before the show. And it was pretty predictable. Peter Sellers would tell a joke about a violinist, and it was very, very funny. So, band leader violinist, doing society gigs, and he'd play the part, with the accent and everything, and somehow get his arm right round there, like a violinist. Always very, very funny. Harry sometimes used to...
Do you remember the story?
Do I remember the story? Not really very well, no. Harry used to occasionally tell a story, and then Harry would sing Falling in Love with Love in E-flat, and Peter Sellers would play the timps at the back, and he used to make a great play of playing a couple of notes, then going around tuning all the taps, the things. And then in the middle of it, somebody would fire a gun, which always used to make me jump. And then we'd be into the show. And the show was usually longer, quite a bit longer actually, than what ended up on the radio, because a lot of it simply couldn't be put on the BBC. I mean, some of the language and some of the innuendos. I mean, this was army humour. I mean, this is the stuff that they'd learnt, or Spike particularly had learnt in the British Army, and it just couldn't survive the BBC. So a lot of that stuff was cut out, and that's how it was.
So some of the music cues that immediately come to mind for me, there's this one raucous chord where the wild vibrato trumpet ending in the cymbal.
That was chord in G. Yeah.
That was chord in G.
Chord in G.
No wonder you're getting royalties for that. That appeared in about every show.
Royalties for that, exactly. That's right. Peter was always doing. One time he came down and he filmed not the show, but he filmed the rehearsal, and he had the most expensive equipment. He had Ariflex cameras and things, and he had them all over the place, and the lights and everything. So there's quite a bit of footage like that. I don't know where it is, but it does exist. Peter used to come with a different car practically every week, because he was used to always changing his car, I mean, he'd buy a Rolls Royce or something, and then he would find something he didn't like about it, or he'd see some other car, and he was dying to have this other car, so then he'd sell the Rolls at a big loss, buy the other car. That was going on all the time. Very often Spike and Peter didn't get on terribly well, and there was friction, and sometimes Spike was just unhappy, really, in general. I don't quite know what out, but he used to go into seclusion very often. I think I heard one story where he went home and he went upstairs and he stayed upstairs and he just wrote up there and wouldn't come down for food. He used to send telegrams then to his wife asking her to send sandwiches up or something like that. I don't know how true those stories are. Peter Sellers, I nearly bought Peter's house. Peter had a lovely house in North London. I think it was either in Totteridge or Finchley or somewhere like that. It's a beautiful house on which he had made an extension, master bedroom suite, beautiful. And I was buying this house for money now that you can't believe. It was going to be £10,500. I mean, that would be about $18,000 or something like that. It's a beautiful house. And I put a deposit down, and I was well into the equivalent of escrow. And then suddenly I had terrible thoughts about living that far. I was living in an apartment in Kensington, very, very central. Get a taxi anywhere. I thought, my God, I was going to live right on the edge of London. And I backed out of it. And I got my deposit back. And then he immediately sold it to a comedian called Alfred Marks. And whilst they were in, Alfred Marks had actually bought it at a certain point, and he owned the house, but Peter was still living in it. Peter, in the meantime, was buying a mansion. No, not a mansion, what do you call it? Rectory or some very grand place. And but Peter was still living in the house. And Peter, of course, was like a small boy. He loved all the things that small boys like, from model aeroplanes to trains to whatever. And whenever certain things came around in the year, like let's see in England, on the 5th of November, there's a thing called Guy Fawkes Day, when little boys make an effigy of the guy and go from door to door, asking for pennies, you see. A penny for the guy, they say. And also grown-ups would have huge bonfires, you see, and mothers would make bonfire toffee, and what else? A parkin, which is a certain kind of rather dark brown cake. Fireworks. And fire. I'm getting fire. And fireworks, you see. So Peter had to have fireworks, you see, being Peter. And on this particular occasion, don't forget, the house is now owned by Alfred Marks. Peter's still living there. And he has rockets, and he has them out in bottles in the garden. And he has, Peter always had a little clutch of people who went everywhere with him. It was like a little gang. And there was an actor called Mario Fabrizi, who died many years ago. And there was an actor called Dave Lodge, and they were inseparable with Peter. And they were there, and they were going to light these rockets and send them up, you see. Peter wanted to photograph it with his Arriflex camera, cine camera. So he was on the inside in the living room with this Arriflex camera that was taking a shot through a plate glass window. I mean, one wall of that house was just a plate glass. He was taking it through there, and his friends were lighting these rockets. Well, the first rocket went up, the second went third rocket went up and then kind of turned and went straight at the plate glass. It came into the living room. They didn't even find the television. I don't know, I think Peter probably ran with the Arriflex. I don't think he was going to sacrifice that. But the house was kind of, that room, and the room next to it was absolutely burnt out. And I thought, my gosh, that could have happened to me. I could have had this. I think, I never did hear the end of that story. I suppose that the insurance paid for it all to be put back and all that. Yeah, that was Peter. And then he used to like walkie-talkies. When walkie-talkies came out, he was driving around in his car with his friends, all in cars, and they were walkie-talkieing, and he loved all that.
Can you tell us something about the band members?
The band members? Well, the band number was always an accompaniment for Max Galdrake.
The band members?
Oh, the band members. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I'm trying to think of some of the people in the band. The lead trumpet was a man called Freddie Clayton, who had been with me in the Giraldo Orchestra many years before. And then there was, who else was in that? My gosh, everybody played in the band at some time or other. The trombones, I remember more. There was a man called George Chisholm, who had been a famous trombone player in England in the 1930s. He'd made records with people like Benny Carter, in the 30s. And he was in the band. And then there was a trombone player called Lad Busby, who played lead trombone with Giraldo when I was there. And he was there during the Finnegan period when Bill Finnegan wrote arrangements for us. Then there was Jackie Armstrong, who played bass trombone. And Jackie and I, he was probably my oldest friend in the business, because Jackie and I had been in Archie's juvenile band when I was 15, and he was probably 18. And he was a wonderful player then. We played lots of Tommy Dorsey arrangements, and he played all those solos without turning a hair, And there were not too many of the people in London who could really play those solos beautifully. So he was there. Jackie actually switched to bass trombone because sometime in the 1950s he had terrible problems with his teeth. And after the work he had done in his teeth, he felt he couldn't play lead trombone anymore, because he had been lead trombone with a band called Ted Heath and played wonderful solos in that band. But now he felt he couldn't do that anymore, and so he went straight down to bass trombone and became a wonderful bass trombone player. Saxophones. The lead alto was a man called Bob Burns, who was a Canadian. He came over to London in 1944 in the band called the Canadian Band of the Allied Expeditionary Force. And their conductor was a man called Robert Farnan, who is very, very famous in Europe anyway. And Bob Burns played lead alto. Bob later on did a European tour with Benny Goodman, incidentally. And Bob liked to drink. And one night on the stand, Bob had probably been drinking quite a bit. And Benny Goodman said to him, "How come you play so good when you're drunk?" And Bob Burns said, "I practice when I'm drunk." He eventually decided to go back to Canada. He's now, as far as I know, in Toronto somewhere. But he did that for years and years and years.
Drummer?
Drummer was Jock.
Bain?
No, Jock Bain was a trombone player who never did the Goon Show. Jock Cummings was the drummer. Ray Ellington, of course, was a wonderful drummer. And he very often used to play other percussion instruments, during our number, bongos or something like that. He was very, very good. Other members of the band.
Judd Proctor.
Judd Proctor played good. Yeah, Judd Proctor actually worked. The band, as a matter of fact, when I first took over conducting that show, we had a band with a rhythm section, we had strings, we had a harp. It's a fairly big band. And then every year, they had decreased the size of the band. And it took me a lot. I mean, I didn't know at that time. Later on, I became wise enough to realize what was going on. The three principals wanted more money. So what did they do? They cut down the band. I'm sure that's what happened, Peter Sellers and Spike and Harry, they probably said, "We'd like a little bit more money, and how could you refuse them if this is the top show, But the BBC being, as penny pinching as it has always been, obviously probably told us we couldn't have strings anymore, or we couldn't have our own rhythm section. We had to use the Ray Ellington Trio as the rhythm section. And eventually I think the harp went. We had a man called Ossian Ellis who used to play the harp, who was a famous chamber player, and also he was a Welshman, and he also did things, Welsh things, where he would sing Welsh songs and accompany himself on the harp, or something like that. I'm not quite sure what he did, but he was deep into Welsh folk music, So, pardon?
Bass player?
Our bass player was the bass player of the Ray Ellington Trio, and Judd Proctor was the guitar, and Dick Katz was Ray Ellington's pianist. And so they played with us when we did a band number, Judd Proctor's a very good guitar player, and he and I went to the same school a long time ago in Yorkshire. The bass player for a certain time was Coleridge Good, and I can't remember the other bass player's name, but Coleridge Good did it for a long time, a black bass player.
You did have strings from time to time, though, right?
Not after a certain year, and I don't know what year we ceased to have strings. Probably after the first year.
Because there's that wonderful cue with the land ho.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we had to make that trilling sound with the woodwind after that, and the trombones did, the usual hackneyed sort of cliche for that kind of music. Yeah. Yeah. So that was the Goon Show.
Any other particular things you remember from incidents?
Oh yes, I can tell you another wonderful thing. In the Camden Theatre, right at the back of the circle, there was a little canteen, a little restaurant there, where we used to go. Well, some of us, you see, the brass would head for the pub next door, but the saxophones would tend to go up to the little place and have tea. You see. So we got there, and there's a little Scottish woman who served us this tea, and she gave us cake and whatever. She used to make some of these things herself. And we did a Goon Show called the Batter Pudding something.
Hurler.
Hurler. The dreaded
hurler.
Batter Pudding Hurler, that's right. And so they told this lady, would she please make a batter pudding? You see, and she did, and she assumed that we were going to eat it, and she took it was made with loving care, and then when she saw what was done with it, she couldn't believe it,
What was done with it?
Well, I mean, it was just a sound effect, wasn't it? They probably hurled it at something, a door or something, went, and that was her batter pudding, which she had made with tender loving care.
Who's the someone in the band? It sounds like who, especially the lewdest World War II joke punchlines. He laughs lasciviously.
I'm not sure who that would be, but there were lots of those jokes. Yeah, and Spike made up names for people that were really two words put together, unmentionable words put together, and depending on how you pronounced it, it
meant like Hugh Jampton.
Well, I'm thinking of that in particular. Yes, that's right. Hugh Jampton. He was Hugh Jampton.
Yes.
You see. I think that actually was allowed on the BBC, but they couldn't figure it out. They didn't see what it was. Yeah. So
Max told me about what it was like working with you, doing the arrangements.
He used to come over one day, usually on a Thursday or something like that, and we'd spend about half an hour just working out what he would do. It was a bit limited because his chromatic harmonica played in C and D flat, you see. So, we always had to play in C. At some point, we then went up to D flat, So it was very, very predictable. Very occasionally, he'd do one where we started in C and went to A flat. But those harmonicas, there was just, there was only that possibility of going up a half tone. So they were restricted by that. One occasion, incidentally, he couldn't be there. He was up in Manchester or something like that, and he couldn't get down to London to do the recording. So he played it from Manchester. He had speaker up, he could hear us, and we played the introduction, and then, he played it over the line.
Called it in?
Yeah.
Phoned it in, right.
Yeah, phoned it in, that's exactly. So, it's a long time ago now. And, yeah, so good. And if you have any questions you would like to put to me, it might evoke some memory of things,
There are stories we've heard about what did they do? Throw a piano down the stairs, or
I didn't know about that. Throw a piano downstairs? I don't know about that.
to get a sound effect.
Oh, I don't know about that.
That all happened, I guess, before.
I'll tell you something interesting. Very, very often, Spike would want a long sound effect that would take quite some time. Well, by quite some time, I mean a minute, you see. And he would write it all in the script, and it would be on the lines of a truck reversing, splintering glass, an aircraft diving. And there would be lots of descriptions. This was this long queue that sound effects people would have to put together, and they usually did that before the Sunday. They'd already have put it together on tape, and that was, comedy, light entertainment. Now then, during the time years later. It was probably 15 years later. I was invited to the BBC to hear, to be a part of an invited audience to hear a big sort of serious concert that was being done by Robert Kraft, who was a serious conductor. He was going to be conducting the music of Edgar Varèse, who was a Frenchman who'd long time lived in New York and wrote very, very discordant music. And there was this work, and Stravinsky was in the control room. Okay, he was kind of supervising in the control room. And I went with a composer friend to this invited concert. And they played one work by Edgar Varèse that had something like 7 movements. Now, 4 of these movements were played by the instrumentalists in the studio, but 3 of them were prepared tapes, which they just played over big speakers, you see. And I'm not kidding you, it was right out of the Goon Show. It was an aeroplane diving, it was a truck reversing, it was splintering glass, it was exactly the same. I thought, my God, this is now high art, you see. Something that Spike used to scribble out and they put together for a Goon Show.
Do you suppose they pinched some things out of the archives?
I don't know whether, I'm sure Edgar Varèse, he probably wrote all those things years before we ever did the Goon Show. I mean, a lot of those things were probably written in the 20s and 30s, and 40s, but we didn't know about it. And I'm sure he didn't, of course he didn't know about what we did.
I should have played them Goon show.
The
afterwards.
Goon Show, exactly, yes.
Show them what they
Yeah.
missed.
Interestingly, Peter Sellers occasionally wasn't there, and I can't think why. I suppose he probably had a cold or ill or something like that. And when Peter Sellers he did so many voices. When he couldn't be there, they brought in about 4 people to replace him, and they didn't exactly do the voices that Peter would do. They did other voices, but Peter was such a remarkable comic actor that he did so much. He gave so much to the show, with all those characters. Blue Bottle and Colonel Bloodknock and.
I think one show you're talking about, Spike did Henry.
Well, that was Peter, and
Peter did Minnie on another show.
It
Peter
could
did
be.
Eccles, unbelievable.
Normally, Peter did Henry, I think, and he did Henry, and Spike did Minnie.
And then the one show where Spike wasn't there,
Oh, I see.
you have to listen extremely carefully. to
Oh,
tell
and
that
Peter actually did. He did both voices.
he did both voices.
That
but
would
he
be
did Eccles extremely well.
And Eccles, yeah. Yeah, then there was Little Jim. That was another character, Little Jim, falling in the water. And then he did a wonderful Saunders, Peter. George Saunders.
Yes.
Wonderful imitation of George
Grit pipe
Saunders.
thing.
Then there was Grit Pipe thing. There was all kinds of stuff, yeah.
Do you do any of these voices yourself?
Me?
No, but you had a flying
But
instructor.
I'll tell you a story. In the mid-50s, when I was doing the Goon Show, I learnt to fly. And I was being taught by an ex-RAF pilot. And this pilot, this instructor, was a great fan of the Goon Show. And he used to give me flying lessons, and he'd be Colonel Bloodknock throughout the whole lesson. Or he'd be Eccles throughout the whole lesson. And I was dying for him to stop, just tell me what to do, It was very, very funny. And I persuaded Peter to make a record, like a disc, acetate, about using these voices and talking about this instructor, and it was all fly. I forget exactly what he did, but it was very, very funny. And I left it for this instructor, but I'm not awfully sure he got it. I think he might have moved on, and he wasn't at the address that he had been. I'm not awfully sure whether he actually received it.
Well, we should try to find that.
I don't think so.
When you did a bunch of actors to replace Peter Sellers,
Yeah.
would you know Peter was not going to be there in enough time, or would they adjust the script knowing that they were going to get the?
I really don't know.
other
I don't really.
actors?
It would have. I can't say. Some of the actors that they had a man called Graham Stark.
He did William.
Yes,
William character.
he was usually Paul, and there was a man called Valentine Dial, and Valentine Dial some years before had been the Man in Black, in a sort of series of radio plays. He had a very, very low voice.
He played Sheriff of Nottingham.
He is probably, yes, I remember that show, Robin Hood, and Bad King John, and I remember that. I remember writing cues for all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an ancient troubadour song in there. Somewhere.
Yes, I think so. I remember that particular. I think we did that one Christmas.
We did it twice.
We did it twice, did we? Oh, I didn't know
One
that.
with Charlotte Mitchell and one.
Yeah. Another thing is that we all had there were scripts all over. Everybody had a script, and we think nothing of it. I used to give my scripts to my kids, and they used to scribble on the other side and then throw them away, So I had no idea that this would mean anything later on. And Harry, and I'm not sure who, at least 2 of them were wonderful artists, cartoonists. And they used to scribble drawings on the back, on the reverse side of a script, and some of them were absolutely wonderful. I mean, Peter was doing drawings of how he imagined Blue Bottle would look. You see, and all that. And another time, Peter was making a film, or was about to make a film called "I'm All Right, Jack." He played the part of a trade union shop steward, and he showed me on the back of the script, Goon Show script, he actually drawn a picture of how this character should look. And that's exactly the way he looked in the film. You know. And I don't know what, I hope that some of those things were saved, you know, all those cartoons and things that they used to do. Absolutely fabulous.
Did you ever do anything with a show called Fred?
No, I had no connection with that. And in fact, I had no connection with anything Goonie that any of them did, except for one thing. Peter Sellers made an album. I don't know whether it wouldn't be two sides of an album, but certainly one side of an album, and it was called The Bridge on the River Wye. And of course, it was the Bridge on the River Kwai, and he played the parts of all the actors in it. There was William, what was his name now? William Holden. He did William Holden's voice. He did Jack Hawkins' voice, and of course he did.
Sasui Hayakawa.
Pardon?
Sasui Hayakawa.
Oh yes, he did. Yes, he did his voice, and he also did Alec Guinness's voice. You see,
He does a great Alec Guinness.
Absolutely brilliantly. So I wrote the cues for that. For that.
I've heard of that. Was that released?
Well, yeah, it was made at EMI. The label probably was Parlophone, and I'll tell you what, the producer, I'm quite sure, was the man who later produced the Beatles,
George Martin.
George Martin. Because when I first used to record at EMI, which was with the Giraldo Orchestra in about 1944, 45, 46, the A&R man was a man called Oscar Preuss. And somewhere along the way, we started to see he had an assistant, you see. And the assistant was George Martin. And then at some time, maybe around 1950, Oscar Preuss retired or something. And then George Martin was the producer. And I did lots of things for the Ted Heath Band in the 1950s, and George Martin was the producer. So I was running into him pretty frequently. And I think I did some things for Mel. I remember recording with Mel County Fair. And I think George Martin might have been the producer on that. And I haven't seen him since he became famous with the Beatles. I've never come across him since, you know.
There was that Beatles documentary where they said that maybe the clincher for why the Beatles decided to go with him as producer was when they heard that he did all the Goon.
Is that right?
recordings.
Yeah.
And he was okay.
Yeah. We got through a lot of producers on that show. I think we started off with Pat Dixon. Then who else did we have?
It was Dennis Main Wilson first.
Dennis Main Wilson. Yeah, Dennis Main Wilson.
How was he?
He was a lot of fun, Dennis. We were very good friends. And he died not long ago, I believe.
Yeah.
Dennis, yeah.
He came and spoke at the Bournemouth Goon Convention.
So, yes, I read that somewhere. Yeah. And then there was a man called Peter Eaton. He was a producer. Then, of course, there was John Browell, who was the final producer, I think. But there were other producers in there, too. There was Johnny... No, you didn't know who that was. No, Johnny somebody. I can never remember his name. There were lots and lots of producers.
Do you remember some of the guest appearances, like A.E. Matthews?
A.E. Matthews?
Remember that?
Gosh, I can't remember.
He completely departed from the script for the last...
I can't remember that. I remember John Snagg. John Snagg was a BBC announcer from, way back, you know. And he came and did... and some of the people, we had Wallace Greenslade, who were just like an announcer, you know. And then there was one before him called Tim somebody or other. And Tim always made us believe he hated the show. But I don't know whether he did or not. It might just have been his... he decided to do that, you know. But
they were built into the script sometimes.
Yeah, probably, yes, built into the script that way was how much he hated the show, that's right. Wallace Greenslade was much more amenable, you know.
He even did some voices occasionally.
That's what I mean.
Yes, I think so. I think so, yeah. Well, Ray Ellington occasionally did some voices.
Yeah.
And even Max occasionally did a voice or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Poogie.
That was Max's name, wasn't it? Poogie, yes.
Conks Geldray.
Conks Geldray, yeah.
He told me that when you two would work together to work out the arrangements, it was as if he only needed to say about a few syllables of what he wanted to say for each thing, and you would get it. And
well, after all that time of working together, we understood each other pretty well. Yeah.
You were a dream arranger.
Well, it was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. I'm glad I did it. But it was totally different from anything else I did, It was a sort of a mad dash. It's sort of a panic on a Sunday panic, that's what it was. Get up, scribble these arrangements, get to the studio, do the show.
Did they ever involve you in mayhem at all?
No. No.
Or the orchestra was sometimes called upon for sound effects. They had to cheer or...
Oh, yeah. We do all kinds of... Whatever Spike wanted, Yeah.
I have to ask you, on behalf of my 11-year-old daughter,
Yes.
Tell us something about the John Williams film score.
John Williams film scores? Well, I haven't...
I'd like to know, too.
I can't tell you how much I admire John Williams for his composing, but his conducting amazes me too, because about how long ago, maybe a year and a half ago, he did a show with the Boston Pops. When he was going back as a guest, I think he'd actually finished being their conductor. He went back as a guest, and he did a show where Stanley Donen came and sat on the stage, in camera, and they put up on the screen about 6 very, very famous dance routines. There was Fred Astaire dancing on the ceiling. There was 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. There was Gene Kelly skating in It's Always Fair Weather, singing in the rain, of course. And then there was a wonderful Sid Charisse routine from the Desert Song. I can't remember the name of the film. And they'd put them on the screen one after the other, and John just just chased them with the orchestra. And boy, he was in the most immaculate sync. I don't know how that could be done. Nobody had headphones. There were no clicks flying around. All John was doing was looking at streamers and looking at the clock. There were some tricky moments. In the dancing on the ceiling was Fred Astaire starting to go. And that has to be right on the beat. How he could get it so exact, I really don't know. And then in the roller skating routine in It's Always Fair Weather, there's a place where he slows down and then he speeds up. So many little tempo changes, Now, for that to be exactly right, it's beyond me to understand anybody who has that kind of skill. And that's quite aside from his composing.
Tell us something about the composing and
He
didn't do all the orchestration himself for all these films.
Well, it depends what you call orchestration, you see. You see, with a composer like John Williams, he's figured out how the orchestra is going to sound. And he writes a very, very complete sketch. Every note is there. You never orchestrate from John. You never have to think of a harmony, of what the harmony might be. It's there, and that's it. He might at some point write something for the trumpets and say woodwind 8 VA and 16 VA. Okay, so you just have to then double it at the octave and in 2 octaves. And then you have some decisions to make about, am I going to use E-flat clarinet up there? How piercing does it have to be? Because, oboes become very, very weak as they get much above the stave, really. And so you have to make decisions about like that. And John leaves that to you, of course. And then in the strings, he won't actually say violas and the second violins. He will assume that you will figure out, depending on what happens, what are you going to use. But and Arthur Morton, who is a very famous orchestrator in this town, Arthur Morton orchestrated for Jerry Goldsmith for very many years. I believe that he doesn't do it anymore. But he used to say it's not orchestration, it's score preparation. And that's what it is. You're just really taking these things that are already decided and you're simply making a full score out of it. And that's all really. There are other composers, of course, who don't do that. There are other composers who leave a great deal for you to figure out. And indeed, there are composers who hum it to you or give you a tape of them playing the piano or something like that. But in the case of these very good composers, like John Williams, like Jerry Goldsmith, they're not going to leave anything to chance. They want to nail it down and make sure it's going to be exactly right, you know. So...
And then do you then go over it with them?
Afterwards?
Afterwards, and
You usually go and see these people, and they'll play it through with you. They'll just read it through with you, saying this and this and this and this and this, and then you go home and you do it. And then the next time it goes to the recording, and that's it, you know.
we saw him conduct a whole program of his music in San Francisco Symphony.
Yeah.
It's just fabulous.
Yeah, he's a very good movie conductor. Some people have that knack of doing that, you know. I certainly don't have that knack. I mean, I've conducted things where I've worn headphones, and I alone have listened to a click. And that works very, very well, particularly if there's no tempo involved, if it's kind of free and rubato. Then you can pull the orchestra around with you. The danger is if you hit a tempo. Once that tempo sort of, it develops a mind of its own. And if you realise that they're drifting away from where they should be, it's not too easy to get them back where they should be. You know, I mean, it's like
Turning back the tide.
it's rather like an express train. You know, in fact, that was the term used by John Williams' music editor, Kenny Womberg. He said, I said, you know, it's like Kenny. He said, yeah, it's like an express train. You know, you can stop sort of a 60-piece orchestra that have got a tempo in their head. You know, but John does it.
Tell us a little bit more detail of some of the films that you wrote. There was
My own films?
Yeah.
Well, I started scoring them in about 1953, you know, and they were pretty awful films. They're things that had started out to be comedies and then ended up not being really very, very funny, and then they found some other adjective to call them, you know. So I wouldn't really like to talk about any of those films that I did at that time. When I got back to movie scoring in the end of the 60s, I did a picture. I started doing some spy things then. I did a picture called The Looking Glass War, which might have been Anthony Hopkins' first movie. And then I did one that he was in called When Eight Bells Toll. That was another adventure thing about bullion ships and people stealing bullion ships, and they'd sink the ships in Scottish locks that are very deep, you know, and then they'd send divers down to salvage the gold and all that stuff. And he was in that. And he came to the studio once. We were recording at a studio in London called CTS. And I don't mean the CTS of today. There was another earlier CTS at a different address. And he came down, and we went and had lunch together next door in some sort of steak place. And that was very interesting.
Captain Nemo.
Then I did one called Captain Nemo and the Underwater City, which was a big adventure story. Some people who are wrecked, and they're rescued by people who come from a city on the bottom of the ocean. And Robert Ryan was Captain Nemo, and Chuck Connors was an American senator who just had to escape. He had, you know, things to do, and I suppose it probably wasn't a very good film, but it was fun. There's an awful lot of music to write. But there was a battle between a shark and a girl, and there was a battle between a giant ray and a submarine, and what else? And they gave the giant ray a roaring sound. I mean, you know, a giant ray would make no sound, presumably, but they thought it should really make a sound. What else? And then there was the escape, because some of these people decided that Captain Nemo said, "You will never go to the surface again. You must stay. For safety of everybody concerned, you must stay now within the city, you know, under the sea." But some of them had things to do. They decided to steal a submarine and escape. And so there was a chase then between the escaping submarine and Captain Nemo chasing them with the other submarine. That was a very long queue, and in fact I wrote it in about 5 queues that all went end to end, you know.
There's a couple of comics who needed a sea shanty.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. It was a lot of fun, a lot of music. And then in the 1970s, I very involved then with a few musicals, you know. There was Jesus Christ Superstar, then there was The Little Prince, and then there was Slipper in the Rose, and then I did Watership Down. That's not very many films in a decade, really. But I was doing other things besides. I mean, I was conducting the BBC Radio Orchestra for a programme that went out on Saturday night. And so I was doing that every week too. And there were other things. They were still recording, albums to do with people or singles to do with people. I was always busy doing other things. And then when I came here, of course, it was... I did a lot of television. Episodes, TV movies. Still doing a little bit of orchestrating for various people who needed it. Like John, of course. And,
how did he find you?
How did he find me? How did you discover me, you mean? I can't really remember. I think he used to show up on some of my recordings at Decca. Sometimes I'd be there with a big orchestra doing Reader's Digest things, and I remember seeing John in the control room at some point. I don't know why he was there, but he was there and he saw what I was doing, and I think it was probably because of that.
Probably heard the buzz about it.
First thing I did with him was a little bit of Star Wars, So it went on.
And the Home Alone films.
Home Alone, yeah, I did. That wasn't orchestrating. First Home Alone, he just asked me to do arrangements of about 6 different Christmas carols, which they put, in various places in the picture, sort of source music and things like that. So I did that. And then for Home Alone 2, there was actually a sequence that starts with an orchestra in some place like Carnegie Hall playing some carol. And that actually had to match up with looking at the orchestra. And then it drifted away then to being background music after that. Yeah. And then Schindler's List, where I just wrote a lot of arrangements for source music. Music to be heard in cafes and nightclubs and restaurants and so on. Yeah.
So that wasn't just score realization?
That wasn't just score preparation, no, it was arrangements. But I had to make things sound like a band in a nightclub in Poland in 1942 or something.
A lot of
tangos and things like that, yeah. Viennese waltzes.
So any more Goon Show stories?
I can't think of any Goon Show stories, really. Max Geller is the one who has a fund of Goon Show because, he thinks of nothing else. I mean, in his retirement, he looks back and the Goon Show is what he thinks about. I've done so many other things in my life, the Goon Show is just a certain part of what I did.
Spike feels the same way.
Spike was quite a character. Last time I saw Peter and Spike, we were in a restaurant in London. What was that restaurant called? An Italian...
Trattoria.
The Trattoria. It was an Italian restaurant in Kensington in London. And we sat... There was a mutual friend who used to play the piano there called Alan Clare. And Alan was a very dear old friend who played beautiful piano, and he had a wonderful memory for things. He used to remember all the Ellington things. Things like Blue Surge, and that most people have forgotten. Alan would remember all those things, and he would remember the exact harmonies and everything. And he used to play all those. And we used to love going there and sitting with Alan, and then going to have something to eat, and then come back and sit with Alan. And of course Spike and Peter loved Alan's playing as well, so we were all there in the bar around the piano one night, and I think that Peter and Spike had been having a good time and consuming quite a bit of alcohol, and they decided to sing a Russian, style song. You know those songs that are very, very sad, you see, and then they pick up speed and they get faster and faster and faster, and then they go sad again, And Peter was doing that. That was the kick he was on that particular night. And
Spike used to take his trumpet and play.
Spike used to take his trumpet in there and play the trumpet,
Were you ever in the Grafton's pub scene?
I think I went there once in my life. The Grafton Arms, Jimmy Grafton. I went there once in my life, yeah. But I think the boys used to go there a lot, Yeah. Right, I'm just about dry now. I think of all ideas and all stories, and don't forget I did an hour and a half, three quarters of an hour of dredging up things from my memory.
I understand you've written 6 chapters.
Ah, yes. Well, I wrote a book which is now on some software that is no longer compatible with my computers. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. It's on those big floppies, there's 5 1/4, those things. And I decided to write. What happened was this. We went to Spain, to southern Spain, one February. I had a terrible journey getting there on a ship that I'm sure nearly went to the bottom. The weather we were in a hurricane. It was quite an adventure in itself. We finally ended up in the south of Spain. It was a very nice hotel, but there was nothing to do. We weren't in a town. We were halfway between Malaga and, what was that? Marbella. And I was very, very bored. And I went down to the little shop and I bought an exercise book. And I took it up to the room and I just started writing things I remembered, you see. And that developed into a sort of the idea of writing a book. And the idea was to write something for my grandchildren, telling them as much as I could remember about the family, about my great-grandparents and my grandparents, all this sort of stuff of people who died years ago, you see, that they might find interesting at some point in their lives to read. And I got up to 6 chapters, yes, that's right. And of course it got into all my adventures with that band, and all that kind of thing, learning how to play instruments. I haven't added a word to it for quite a few years now.
Do you have any words of wisdom for young musicians?
Gosh, I think they don't need my words of wisdom. They're so brilliant, a lot of these young people. They're much better players than I ever was, because they do everything the right way. I mean, they go to a music school and they study and they practice, and they're just brilliant players. I think they know exactly what to do. How they're going to make a living playing the instrument later is another question, because there aren't all that many opportunities. I think they have to have something special to make it. What do you think, John?
I'd say, well, I look at it more through writers, through arrangers and writers, to find a mentor,
to find
somebody
a mentor.
to glom onto.
Yes,
to find a place to be an apprentice.
Yes.
Angela has advised various writers this way. She likes to do that. She enjoys
I used to go down, when I lived in LA, I used to go down once a year. Buddy Baker had a course that he was teaching down at USC, that's right, of people who were studying how to write music for television and movies. And he used to invite me down once a year, and I used to talk to them for, a couple of hours. I used to take hands-on things for them to do. I used to show them a video that I used to take home from Lorimar or Warner Brothers or something of scenes without music. And I said, well, this is the thing that has to be scored. And then we'd talk about how to do it. And then I would say, well, my solution was as follows. And I'd pass around, I'd have lots and lots of photocopies made of notes and sketches and things. I'd pass them all out. And then finally I would play them the same thing but with the music. And then we'd move on to something else, do the same thing with something else, So...
a lot of people are trying to do it without musical training much.
Well, since synthesizers have come along, there's a whole new breed of composer, and a lot of them are very good musicians, of course, but there are an awful lot of people who really don't know how to write music. Who if they had to exist in the world without synthesizers, where it had to be written for the orchestra, simply couldn't do it. But because they can do it at home or in their garage or something like that on synthesizers, they find that they can do that. And they're scoring an awful lot of things nowadays.
Do you have a clear image in your mind's ear of the whole orchestration or something?
Orchestration of something?
Yeah.
Oh yes, I remember all kinds of things.
I mean, as I'm working.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I hear the whole thing in my mind. I still go to the piano. I don't actually work at the piano. A lot of people sit at the piano and they have a great big board, and they do it up there. I've never done that. I've always, even in the years when I worked at the piano, I used to have a thing on the side, And I mean, all those years that Max used to, and I did the Goon Show, I used to sit at an awful little piano that I had, terrible thing, and I'd work on the side like that. But quite a lot of years ago now, I decided to get away from the piano, and I sit at a desk. Certainly all the stuff I did when I lived in LA, I do sitting at a desk. And I go to the piano when I need to try something, just to be sure about that something is going to work the way I think it should work. I go to the piano.
But you know how certain groups of instruments will sound together. You have that passion.
Oh yeah,
in your mind
I think
very
all
clearly.
arrangers, when you say that, John, all arrangers have a feeling of how a thing,
Yeah.
they can hear the sound in their mind,
The difference between acoustical instruments and a synthesizer is that a synthesizer will have a synthesized sound of an instrument that is the whole range of the keyboard,
Yeah.
whereas the acoustical instrument itself might be
Ah.
2 or 3 octaves
It has
shorter.
has a certain range.
So it's giving you an artificial range of the instrument where you
Yeah.
can. A flute can only go up to
Yeah. High
S,
Yeah.
and the synthesizer can go up to X
Yeah.
because it has that many other keys. And what they do is take that sound and speed it up artificially to raise the frequency. So sometimes
Doesn't
people
relate to a true
who
orchestral
it's
sound.
hard to learn to orchestrate for acoustical instruments on a synthesizer because it gives you a false sense of
Yeah.
range.
Time will
Yeah.
Yeah.
fix that one too.
Every,
Right.
every instrument is rather like an actor. It has a certain role that it plays in music. They do typical things. Yeah, I mean, a flute will do things totally different from what a trombone would do because they're in very different registers, of course. But they have a different character anyway, and I think you have to have all that in your mind of what the roles that these instruments like to play.
Looks like we're running almost out of tape.
I'm glad. And now I can go
Comes a
home.
time.
I can go and relax.
I have to ask you 2 other names. Do you know a drummer named Milt Holland?
Milt Holland? No, I don't.
He's a friend of mine. I wonder if
Should I know Milt Holland?
Well, I don't know whether he's still playing, but he was.
he's not playing still.
What? He is?
He's not.
He's
Oh.
not. He's not.
He was a well-known. I remember he played on this album with Bud Shank.
Yeah.
I think it was a Bossa Nova album from Milt Holland, and I remember him from some other album covers. And a very good percussionist. Very good.
Who was the other
And the
name?
other one.
And the other one is, you must know Peter Shickley.
Yes, I hear Peter Shickley on the car radio. I'm sometimes on the radio in the house. Yeah.
He's did all those PQ Bach for 30 years.
Yes.
And he's also been composing a whole lot of serious music.
Yes,
Yeah.
I heard a quartet recently that he had done on
American.
St. Paul Sunday.
Yeah.
Yeah, quite good.
And the New York Philharmonic did his first symphony last November, which is just amazing.
Yes, he's got a serious
I
side
think
too.
I'd be more interested in the serious side of him
Yeah.
than his humorous side.
They did a piece called Oedipus Tex
Went-
recently in
went-
Scottsdale we
to a
went to.
Yeah, and a choir, local choir, did it, Oedipus Tex, and I hated it.
The one movement was for choir with piano, and they used the chorale Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring,
Yeah.
but they added a beat to each bar.
That was funny. That was funny to hear something altered, just a little, something very well
It
known.
flowed on
altered
the
just
piano
a
the
little.
way that it should, but it was just one beat out, like
Right.
doing a 5/4
Yeah,
waltz or
right.
something,
Yeah, in fact, there used to be a pianist here, who died some years ago. Now, who was that pianist?
Johnny Quineri.
Johnny
Johnny
Guarneri.
Guarneri. He played
He used to
everything
play
in five.
piano at
Yeah,
the
Tail of the
Tail of the Cock.
Tail of the Cock, and he tried to play everything in 5/4.
Yeah.
He had this Michigas about 5/4.
Peter Shickley also did an opera on top of Eine kleine Nachtmusik.
Did he? Yes.
Eine kleine is exactly as written, and then there's 2 voices.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Thank you very
Great.
much.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
But it's nice to have
Thanks
finished.
for sending out that blurb about
Oh,
this
yeah.
whole thing.
Well, it was Angela's.
It's been quite an experience.
Yeah, it was. I had written to Angela about. I thought I'd heard that somebody mentioned about a box set of goon shows.
Yes.
That was being, so I called you, and then you gave me Dick Baker's.
Dick Baker. Do you know who Dick Baker is? I gave him Dick Baker's email.
He's been to visit you, right?
Yes, we met in Palm Springs.
Oh, yeah, Palm
We went to see Max, and it just so happened that we were there with Max together.
When do you think you'll see Max next?
We talk every week.
Yeah, I talk to Max at least every week.
I have something for Eddie.
Oh, for Eddie. That's
And I was supposed to mail this to him, and I haven't yet.
Look at that. Isn't that incredible?
Play.
I made it.
You made
I
it.
bought a chewy thing and sawed it off and drilled a hole and made a little ceiling
I
crack.
appreciate
Oh,
that.
Max is going to be so amused.
Eddie's the boss of the house. Eddie Thatcher is his boss.
I should just
And they
video
used
this
to
with
have a
a
poodle. They used to have a little tiny teacup poodle called Margaret. So it was Margaret and Eddie Thatcher, you know. Brother and sister, they said.
We have 3 cats, and everything in the house, life is a chewy toy. We have 1 kitten.
Does everybody give you cat souvenirs, cat cards?
No, in the beginning, but then they stopped.
Yeah, one out of ideas.
So if you could give this to Eddie for me.
I'd be delighted.
It's a ceremonial gift. I don't expect Eddie to play. Because it would ruin it, I'm sure.
Well, it would take some time to learn. Of course, Max would teach. Wonderful. Well, that's incredible.
Yeah, now we'll have to go see him.
All right, now I'm going to go see. All right.
You know what that is.
It's a pleasure.
Yes. Goodbye.
Lovely to meet you, David.
Oh, I know that.
Then you can go.